Hello, everybody. Welcome to the fourth session of the, we have a problem, Houston. Does everybody hear that feedback? Cody?
I just muted Rachel and it sounds better for me now. Is it better for everyone?
Well, I think so, yeah. Good. Sorry about that. We'll continue.
I had two things on.
Okay. Welcome to the fourth and final session of today. The topic is different ways of presenting history, a topic I'm particularly interested in, because if you are a descendant of a science, people, quit playing around. Okay, maybe I need to mute myself. I can't mute myself. Cody?
You're hearing, I'm not hearing any echo, but it sounds like you might be.
I was. Yeah, I am. I hear my voice repeated to me over the speaker.
I know we are on multiple devices. Are there any other windows or on your iPad? Are those open?
No, nothing is open.
Maybe then a quick refresh of the page will get us where we need to be.
I'm trying to see how to do that here. It doesn't matter. If nobody else can hear it, I'm just going to muscle through. So we have three speakers today. The first is Sabina Allen. Sabina is going to speak about climate change, oral history, and conflicting notions of knowledge, a methodological approach. Sabina is born in Sitka and grew up in Southeast and Southern Maine. Be interesting to hear the commonalities between those two places. She's a member of the Tlingit people, Ganachtidi Raven, and a child of the Pakhtan. She's a doctoral student at the University of Chicago, working on scholarly work on the focus on Tlingit responses to catastrophe through time and their current implications regarding climate change. Go ahead, Sabina.
Thank you so much. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our panel today. Before I start my presentation, I would like to introduce myself in my language. Tlingit ayachat, andach jun yachat duasak, tlaika henach Sabina yachat duasak, yesh nachat siti, ganach teidi, kagwantan yadi, shitka kwan ayachat. Hello, everyone. I am Tlingit. My name is Andach June. My English name is Sabina. I am Raven moiety of the Ganach Teidi clan and a child of the Kagwantan clan, and I'm originally from Sitka. Today, I am going to tell you a little bit about how my academic work intersects with varying ideas of what constitutes history, and whether or not that word should even be used in the context in which I work. I will then go over some of the methodological approaches I will be employing in my dissertation that also question and expand the idea of history. My work centers on Tlingit oral tradition about catastrophe and how this knowledge is being applied in current moments of climate change. I have been considering this topic since I was an undergraduate and have been building on it further during my time as an anthropology PhD student at the University of Chicago. I'm currently in the midst of writing my dissertation proposal with the hope of defending it in the spring of 2023 and heading to the field in the fall of 2023. My project is technically an anthropology project, although I would say it falls much more readily under the banner of Indigenous studies. I chose anthropology in part because its methodologies allow for consideration of oral history and stories as evidence, as other disciplines sometimes fail to do. Of course, early anthropological work also cast oral tradition as myth, also dismissing its importance as history. I will first describe some of these tensions as I have experienced them before moving into my own methodology and thoughts on history in my work. During my time as an undergraduate, I was writing about the herring protectors in Shikakuan for a class where we were required to do a peer review assignment. I was using oral history in my work, looking at stories about floods, glacial advance, and colonialism. The person reviewing my paper told me that I needed to include dates for the oral history stories because without dates, they could not be used as evidence. In Indigenous studies, coming up against such claims is a common issue. Stories in oral history are often invalidated, being called myths and legends. For example, John Swanton's 1909 collection of Tlingit stories is called Tlingit Myths and Texts. However, culturally, these are not myths. They are historical accounts of Southeast Alaska, from its creation and geographical shaping by Raven to its habitation by Tlingit people. Nonetheless, I once also got a comment from a professor about how using the term history is also problematic when applied to non-Western stories of the past. The professor claimed that history is a Western notion and that it should not be used to describe Indigenous stories because it carries its own intellectual baggage. This poses an obvious conundrum. While stories being relegated to the realms of myths and legends writes them off as pure fantasy, it may be seen as an appeal to Western authority to label them as history. Because my own work centers on Tlingit oral tradition about reckoning with catastrophic events as they come together in the past, present, and future, it grapples with the question of history from a methodological perspective. One goal of my work is to illustrate the potential for these old Tlingit approaches when thinking about climate change and policy now. In order for this to come across, attentiveness to stories as history is required. However, I also do not wish to require that Tlingit people fit ourselves into rigid boxes to gain Western legitimacy. This can be a frustrating line to walk, especially when considering how scientific inquiry fits into this. Often there will be a news article about how some Western scientific discovery has proved something that Indigenous people have known for a very long time. It is, of course, frustrating to hear from settler society that your knowledge needs to be proved. This invalidates Indigenous epistemologies, the inheritance of Indigenous knowledge, and the capacity of Indigenous thought. It is also tied directly to the invalidation of stories. On the whole, Indigenous oral knowledge is invalidated by the academy and mainstream society in the past and the present, which leads to an inability for it to be applied to future-oriented thinking. This also impacts the way Indigenous knowledge is applied to policymaking. There are numerous current projects emphasizing the need for Indigenous management. This requires an acknowledgement of successful historical management by Indigenous peoples. However, it also requires placing these histories into a framework of legibility to non-native entities. Thus, another difficulty here is balancing what ought to be made legible and what ought not be made legible. In the case of policy, certain knowledge needs to be legible to policymakers so it can be implemented in a way that is better for local ecosystems. Here, it is useful to deploy terms like history and science as a means of making knowledge legible so as to return management to traditional caretakers. This is only one example of how traditional knowledge is being deployed. For my work, the most important methodological factor is an attentiveness to community feelings about these terms and approaches, as well as a place-based insistence that respects the specificity of these histories for the past, present, and future. Indeed, the non-linearity of the Tlingit understanding of history and the inseparability of past, present, and future are also key to my methodology. The Tlingit language has two words that might be translated as history. These are shagun and shuka. While ha-shagun and ha-shuka are both translated in the Gold Belt Heritage Dictionary as our history, they each also illustrate a connection to lineage, meaning both ancestors and descendants. Shuka translates literally to that which lies before us. Each can be understood as both heritage and destiny. Whereas Western understandings of history are strictly linear, shagun and shuka are nonlinear. While shagun and shuka suggest events in the past, they also encompass the present and future, linking the expanse of time in a way that extends beyond the idea of history. For me, taking these Tlingit concepts as a starting place is key. It illustrates that from a Tlingit perspective, the concept of history is not relegated to the past. It is inseparable from the present, all that we have inherited, and the future, that which we and our descendants will inherit. This is distinct from any Western definition of history, yet in translation, both shagun and shuka can be understood in English through the idea of history. This is the legibility that I previously mentioned. While it is not always necessary, legibility is sometimes required to communicate with a wider audience and create a generalizable framework that can have rippling implications across time and space. For my project, both a proper understanding of history, that is from a Tlingit perspective, and a proper relationality to stories are essential. I hope that by understanding history as only a loose translation of Shogun and Shuka, I can move beyond the confines of the concept of history in a Western sense. This must account for knowledge sharing that connects threads throughout time and that is not necessarily linear. Here I would like to draw on Mark Rifkin's book, Beyond Settler Time, which argues that colonization is predicated in part on the process of disrupting rhythms of the colonized and turning them to the temporal framework of the colonizer, which is then framed as natural. It is also worth noting here Eileen Morton Robinson's discussion in The White Possessive of how whiteness is an underlying system that professes itself as normative objectivity despite being highly constructed. Both authors see settler colonialism as creating a false sense of inevitability, which places Indigenous beliefs outside of the norm. Rifkin discusses how Native people are either relegated to the past or assimilated into settler systems of time. So too is often the case with oral history and the oral tradition. It is either thought to be something of the past, the remnants of which was collected by early anthropologists, or it is used but requires a date assigned to it. It must be assimilated into terms that are legible within settler colonial culture and settler temporality. While in Tlingit history, the place where something occurs is of utmost importance. In a settler rendering of history, the time when something occurred becomes of utmost importance. Thus, fitting the Tlingit oral tradition into Western epistemologies requires a retroactive fitting of settler time onto these narratives. This harkens back to the anecdote I shared a few minutes ago. Dates are required to make something into evidence. Similarly, Rifkin discusses how lineal descent becomes encoded as heteronormative patriarchal lineage of inheritance. Such renderings of descent are also not in alignment with Tlingit understandings of Shogun and Shuka. Tlingit descent is matrilineal, and kinship is much more expansive than simply the nuclear family. The clan is the most important social organization of family. Thus, Tlingit understandings of history as it relates to lineage, both ancestral and descendants, are incompatible with settler renderings of inheritance. As such, I intend to rely on Tlingit kinship formation and Tlingit nonlinear time, wherein past, present, and future are all relevant to Shogun and Shuka, so as to avoid falling into these reductive settler categories of temporality. With these complications in mind, I would like to review some of the scholars whom I would like to follow in my work so as to attend to the various ethical and methodological conundrums I have laid out. Something I've been considering as I prepare to write my dissertation is the type of knowledge systems I am foregrounding. While academic writing often requires historical citation in relation to the canon of various disciplines, I am much more interested in the tradition of Tlingit thought through oratory. I do not wish to appeal to Western standards of what does and does not constitute theory. Rather, I turn to Diane Million's conception of embodied theory. Of Indigenous stories, she writes, quote, "They are powerful because they are engaged in the articulations that interpret who we are in the discursive relations of our times. We engage in questioning and reformulating those stories that account for relations of power in our present. That is theorizing," end quote. Similarly, Max Lieberow's work insists on centering relationality and gratitude in their citational practice. Within this understanding, I also wish to center my community in my own citational practice in order to emphasize that, as Lieberow writes, quote, "No intellectual work is authored alone," end quote. Ethical concerns about the nature of citations and knowledge production inevitably begs the question of methodology. In this work, I follow Linda Tuaway-Smith's notion of decolonizing research, specifically with the idea in mind that all research ought to first and foremost benefit the community. I wish for this project to be useful and to record in an appropriate manner for outsiders Indigenous techniques to address climate change. This is designed to foreground Tlingit relationality in place as a means of interrupting damaging settler systems. I intend to approach my work both methodologically and theoretically through the framework of care, which is also something emphasized in clan stories and in the Ku'ich or memorial potlatch. Because catastrophe has been present throughout history in Tlingit homelands of Southeast Alaska, community care has always been a necessity. This has continued in the face of colonialism and continues to this day. Hele, Julia Hobart, and Tamara Knies define radical care as, quote, a set of vital but underappreciated strategies for enduring precarious worlds, end quote. They explain that it can be, quote, employed against immediate crises and precarious futures, end quote. Radical care, or community care as I've called it, has helped to endure precarious worlds, futures, and crises in Southeast Alaska since time immemorial. Because of the solution and care-oriented nature of this project, the benefit to the community is paramount in the purpose for this research. I start from community concerns and intend to listen to community voices to shape the trajectory of my work and its potential implications in policy. With that in mind, this discussion is not meant to be universalizing or universally applicable. It is also inherently rooted in a people and a place. Tlingit response to climate change cannot be universalized. It is based on specific cultural knowledge and history in a specific place. Thus, I turn to Liberone's discussion of universalism and generalizability. Liberone argues, quote, generalizability is about commonality, shared characteristics, and overlap. Things that generalize can still be place-based and have difference, despite similarities, end quote. Tlingit response to climate change can be generalized and placed in a larger web of Indigenous projects that are future-oriented against climate change. I've already mentioned the necessity for focus on Tlingit notions of history, Shagun and Shuka, in this process. This project understands those concepts as temporally expansive. While it includes older clan stories, it also considers life stories, current projects, and future plans. Following Millian, these are all examples of lived theory. Indeed, anthropologists have written about how when seeking to hear life stories of Tlingit elders, they were told an array of older stories as context that were then connected to aspects of the person's life. As such, we can understand less of a divide between the idea of history far in the past and more recent events. Similarly, larger collective stories are viewed in relation to personal life events. Stories are all connected and all have value. I thus wish to follow the principles of Joanne Archibald's Indigenous story work in order to engage ethically with clan stories and personal stories of community members I encounter during fieldwork. This framework relies on ethical engagement with stories, relying on relationality and how the researcher considers such narratives. Archibald lays out the necessity for long-term commitments in this work that is respectful to the community, the storyteller, and that forces the listener to, quote, hear and remember what they said and to share or represent their teachings respectfully, responsibly, and accurately, end quote. This is positioned against forms of extraction, which have often characterized work with Indigenous communities. Such a move also relates to Hobart and Knies' discussion of care through solidarity, which, quote, relies on working with communities and asking them what they need rather than making paternalistic assumptions, end quote. This collaborative approach is vital to Indigenous story work and ethical research engagement from an Indigenous perspective. On this note, I also wish to engage Sarah Florence Davidson's writing on Indigenous story work. Davidson emphasizes the need to engage with ceremonial principles in the ethical construction of a research project. Ceremony encompasses storytelling and good relationality, in this case from a Haida perspective. In Tlingit ceremonial practice, stories, history, are a key aspect of maintaining relationality between clans and between guests and hosts. In an essay titled Following the Songs of Ka'ad Ao, Davidson discusses her own practice in her community and methodological engagement to research in an appropriate manner from a Haida perspective. From Sean Wilson's book, Research is Ceremony, Davidson takes up the notion of relational accountability, quote, guided by the importance of maintaining strong and respectful relationships, end quote. She always engages with Archibald's story work principles, including respect, responsibility, reverence, reciprocity, holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. Through her discussion, Davidson explains the importance of treating the stories told to her, not traditional stories, but personal stories of Indigenous students, with respect, while also remembering her own responsibility to the students as a researcher. This included her obligations to give back to her community and be in good relations with them. To take a culturally rooted approach to the notion of relationality and reverence and as it manifests in the potlatch, Davidson and her family actually gave a ceremony where she presented her work to the community through an act of gifting, which is one primary aspect of the potlatch and emphasizes that she does not own the research. Similarly, Davidson's book, Potlatch's Pedagogy, discusses her experience working with Haida and other First Nation students. Many struggled in school, likely because, as she points out, they are in a foreign settler colonial system that is often unfriendly and that has always sought to assimilate students and erase unsavory histories. Her work considers how Indigenous pedagogy might be utilized to create better pedagogy within Western systems. She makes it very clear that this is not an invitation to appropriate Haida culture and lifeways. Similarly, I do not aim to extract stories from Tlingit people to then be used by the Academy. As a Tlingit anthropologist, I also do not view my role as translating Tlingit knowledge into Western systems of knowledge. I view my engagement with stories and community as a form of relationality and learning. Through this process, I may choose to write about particular aspects of what I learn. However, this is ultimately in an effort to make Western systems useful to Indigenous people, not so that Western systems may use this knowledge in an extractive way. If Tlingit notions of Shagun and Chuka are to be respected by the Academy and by settler society, they need to be treated with the Indigenous storywork principles and not merely used as a fix for settler notions of history or for settler problems. In general, Indigenous knowledge systems ought to exist on their own terms. When considering the idea of history and its conflicting variations, the particulars of each culture ought to be consulted before jumping to conclusions based on settler metrics of authenticity or even critique. Ultimately, scholars like Davidson and Lee Barone are pragmatic regarding their approach to the Western education system and the Academy. They are not rejecting it completely, but bending it to work for Indigenous people. In the end, I propose the same approach when thinking about history. If the term history serves to create needed legibility, I have no issue using it with necessary explanations. But there is no need to appeal to forms of authority through Western categories that can be but a loose translation of Tlingit concepts and theories. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sabina. That was very, very interesting, and I appreciate your contribution to this conference. We will have time for questions, but we're going to do questions after all three speakers have talked. Why is my photographs frozen? Can you see me?
Yes.
My screen is okay. Am I frozen on your screens?
Yes.
I think that's a classic
Okay.
Alaska
Oh,
bandwidth.
shoot. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
We'll just go with what I'm
Yep.
saying.
Yes.
The next speaker is Rachel Mason, who's the person who actually organized this conference for us, aside from other things, and has been a very active developer of historical and anthropological work for a long time in Alaska. Rachel wrote about herself in the program that she is a senior cultural anthropologist for the National Park Service in Alaska region. She's worked as an anthropologist in Alaska for many years. She is the vice president of the Alaska Historical Society. Thanks. Rachel?
Thank you. Let me try sharing my screen.
Can you go forward?
I'm trying. I'm trying to share. Okay. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Great. All right. Well, I'm going to start with a quote from George Orwell about the concept of objective truth. Lies will pass into history. Long ago, I developed the idea that historians are more concerned than anthropologists about getting the facts straight and pickier about tracking down dates and names. And I thought it was because anthropologists are more willing to believe that every culture has its own reality. Since then, however, I've learned that historians also realize that reality changes according to one's cultural or historical perspective. And now, after many years of working in Alaska, I want to reflect on whether I have been on a quest for objective truth. One difference between the two disciplines is that anthropologists bend over backwards not to say that one culture is superior to another, even though, as Sabina has shown us too, most of us are clearly products of Western culture. Historians, however, don't mind producing some areas dismal, like the Dark Ages or the Depression. Both disciplines have come to realize, though, I think that none of us can escape the biases of our own culture or our historical era. Can we ever say that one culture or era values the truth more than another? Certainly, you could make the argument that we're seeing a flourishing of blatant lies in our own culture in the present day. Neither history and anthropology are social sciences, which means that we get even less respect than real sciences. And notice here in this cartoon that the real scientist is an old man with a gray beard. The social scientist is an angry feminist with purple hair. But I guess the point is that social scientists cannot back up their theories with scientific proof. And when I applied to the National Science Foundation for a dissertation grant, I was told sternly that this is the Science Foundation, not the Humanities Foundation. So I needed to put my research project in the form of a hypothesis to be investigated with the scientific method. I did try that. It felt a little like putting lipstick on a pig, but that's one message we get. So real anthropology work to me is subjective and experiential. And participant observation involves submerging yourself in a culture as if you were a member or pretending to be a member. Historians can't really do that, but they too tap on personal experience as a source of information about a larger social context. And both disciplines rely on the imperfect memories and perceptions of participants in the culture. Two different anthropologists can come up with completely different interpretations of the same culture, depending on who they talk to, even the personality of the anthropologist. And similarly, two historians might have two divergent interpretations of the same historical events, depending on whose perspective they are taking, also maybe the personality of the historian. The conquered have a different story from the conquerors. And for example, Americans have long celebrated Columbus Day, but to Indigenous people, Columbus's arrival is not something to celebrate. Historians have been accused of writing mostly about kings, presidents, and emperors who leave behind a rich historical record. Anthropologists, too, have usually gravitated toward the powerful and visible sectors of society to learn about culture, but the demands of participant observation also limit anthropologists to the people that will talk to them. When doing cultural research, if two sources disagree, how do you know who's right? Both anthropologists and historians gravitate toward cultures or eras that they like and that they identify with. And some might even go so far as to wearing the customary clothing of that group or period, or even marrying somebody from that culture. Anthropologists and historians also trust some informants more than others. I've worked with anthropologists who thought only people over 55 were worth talking to. What happens if elders disagree with one another? I like to talk to marginal people, the ones that no outsider ever talks to, rather than interviewing outspoken people who have often told their stories. Historians also worry about credible sources, and perhaps more than anthropologists, I think. Carefully of scrutiny of records might reveal that a census taker made up some results or a cannery record keeper cooked the books. But for both disciplines, finding the truth is really not a matter of finding the most popular opinion, the number of sources who believe something, but finding what's most plausible to the researcher. In the past, anthropologists who exaggerated or made things up were protected by the remoteness of the people they studied, perhaps because their subjects were unlikely to read anything they wrote. Anthropologists like Napoleon Chagnon, pictured here, have been accused of making it all up, or worse, doing harm to the people that they studied. Today, anthropologists work at the behest of contemporary people. They need to answer to the people they write about. Historians, too, might hold back from revealing sources because they realize the consequences of publishing sensitive information. And anthropologists may also need to keep their information confidential. Today, I think it's safe to say the public is more interested in hearing about culture from a member of that society than from the anthropologist. The anthropologist might be an expert in the culture, but not qualified to speak for members of the group. Who is right when people disagree with a linguist about how to pronounce words in their own language? And what if people are spouting misinformation about their own culture? For example, one day when I visited the Alaska Native Heritage Center, an Inupiaq youth led us around the traditional house. Did you know that polar bear is the only species that eats humans as part of its normal diet? He asked the shocked group. I bit my tongue, not wanting to challenge this youth in front of a group of tourists, but I wondered if I should say something to the management. I'll give a few examples from my work in Alaska of times when I became aware that the finding or presenting the truth, the objective truth, became problematic. And the Exxon Valdez oil spill was one of those times. It occurred soon after I arrived on Kodiak Island to conduct research on commercial fishing, and there were conflicting views about the cultural and economic effects of the spill. And just incidentally, for members of the association, of the society, it looks on the far right, it looks like our own Toby Sullivan in an anti-Exxon protest there. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, for weeks, there were daily meetings. There were tense exchanges between community members and Exxon, VECO, and government representatives. And in subsequent years, I worked on several studies of the impacts of the spill, including one for the lawsuit against Exxon for subsistence damages. And the strategy seemed to be to show that Alutiiq Supiaq culture was intact before the oil spill, but that the spill ruined everything. And I was expected to collect data that supported that narrative. I was very sympathetic to the cause of suing Exxon, but I was unwilling to suppress the stories that some people kept on eating fish and deer as they did every year. And the lawyers thought I was a loose cannon. You need to show, when you're making a legal case, you need to show that you suffered and that you can give it a monetary value. And so this was my first experience with the need to dance with the one that brung you. When you're working for, whether you're working for the government or for industry or for a Native organization, there is pressure to find a truth that fits the story. Subsequently, I worked for both the state and the federal subsistence programs in Alaska. And for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, I went around doing household subsistence harvest surveys in rural, mostly Native communities. Anti-subsistence forces often accuse subsistence users of lying about their subsistence uses, exaggerating their harvest to show a need, or maybe minimizing their illegal harvests. Yes, we once did have a local assistant who filled out all the surveys herself, explaining that she knew what each of the people had harvested. The researcher might also be tempted to gerrymander a sample. If you take a 50% of sample of households and the sample misses a super harvester who accounts for a large portion of the community's harvest, you might be enticed to run the sample until it goes your way. But on the whole, though, I think the harvest surveys collect remarkably reliable data, and as I've heard many times, it would have to be an immense conspiracy to try to tilt all the data in a certain way. When I moved to the federal subsistence program, a large part of my job was to write analyses of subsistence proposals and make recommendations. And some of the anti-subsistence people often accused the anthropologist of bias toward natives, or even toward particular groups of natives, and were skeptical of any claim of Alaska Natives to cultural and spiritual connections to subsistence resources. Managers were often impatient with traditional knowledge. For example, claims that the fish are there, just not showing themselves to people that are not respectful to them. Things have changed in the last few decades, and now managers are, I think, encouraged to incorporate both traditional knowledge and some Western scientific findings in any subsistence decisions. This is convenient when traditional knowledge agrees with science, but when the two ways of knowledge conflict, Western knowledge usually prevails. So that's one. I'll move to another project. This is one of my favorite projects of all time. That was an early project I worked for at the National Park Service that was initially a compliance project that began when a visitor center was planned in the neighborhood where prostitutes had lived, and worked in a row of small houses called The Line, and they're shown in this picture. And The Line was open during the years 1914 to 1952. And my job was to ask people about their memories of the prostitutes who worked on The Line. And some of you who are familiar with Klondike Kate and other gold rush ladies might expect that the prostitutes were a glamorous group. However, the customers remembered them as dowdy and elderly, and certainly not very glamorous. A man who had been a customer of Dutch Emma's, she's the best known prostitute on The Line, said that she was the homeliest woman he'd ever seen. Another resident of Seward, who had been friends with several of the ladies, wanted to make sure that they weren't overly romanticized or ridiculed. She said they were ordinary business people trying to make a living. Most of the people that I talked to for the study were children at the time that the red light district was open, and what they remembered was the generosity of the ladies at Halloween or in giving tips to the newspaper paper boy. And a woman who had been a teenager when The Line was open remembered that the women were glamorous and fashionable, and they passed on fashion magazines to her. So here's a picture of one of the women. The woman pictured here had retired from The Line by 1953, when it was almost the end of The Line. And she was a landlady for a young couple, Dwayne and Santa Levan, whose young daughter is pictured here. There was some mystery about the reason The Line closed in 1954, and there were several theories, including one that all the red light districts all over Alaska were closed as a condition of statehood. And that was left ambiguous in our report. One woman knew the real reason, she said, but she was unwilling to tell the story because some could still be hurt by it, even many years later. So from that project, I learned more about, I learned about different memories depending on who you were. But I also learned that sometimes it's more important to protect those rather than having a definitive answer of the objective truth. It's better just to leave the story untold. Then moving on to another project, the other National Park Service project that I want to talk about. This has occupied me for well over a decade. And this dealt with 4 Aleutian villages that disappeared forever during World War II because of the evacuations and relocations of their residents, or in the case of Attu, their imprisonment in Japan during the war. So this was a history project, but it offered a chance for me to use my skills as an anthropologist working with contemporary people. By the time I started working on this, those which was in the early 2000s, those who had lived through World War II in the Aleutians had already dwindled to a few survivors, and now they're almost all gone. All the veterans who fought in World War II that we worked with are gone now. So here's a picture of some of the veterans that fought in the war and some of the evacuees that the 2 groups joined in a commemoration on Alaska in 2017. But working with the survivors and the descendants of evacuees and veterans, I had to contend with there were often conflicting perspectives of the war. And when you add the descendants of Japanese soldiers, that was another part that the conflicting memories, the same events, but with vastly different perspectives on those events. And here's a picture of Macushan in the 2009 trip with Nick Lukanoff, the elder in the front, showing us where the church had been, and with some of the descendants of the village there too. But on the subject of Macushan, here's another thing that's come up. This is a photo by Ted Bank from the 1950s, but it's one I've been sent several times by an unhinged man who insists that before the war, there was a cannery operating in the village. And the large building on the right that you see a long roof, he thinks that's the cannery. And he bases his claim on a brief visit he made there for a military exercise in 1956. And he has presented his case with increasing hostility, calling Ray Hudson a liar, insulting Park Service staff, and seeking the ear of high officials of the Department of the Interior to right this wrong that there really is a cannery there. So that's a little bit of light relief, I guess. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Attu experience. Really, this was the experience of the Attu residents in World War II was particularly tragic. The residents of the remote village were taken as prisoners to Japan during the war, and almost half of them died there of hunger and disease. Nick Golodoff, who's the little boy in the picture, in the center of the picture there, his memoir, Attu Boy, tells of friendships between the Attu children and their Japanese captors. But the truth, or finding the truth about the treatment of Attu residents during their imprisonment in Japan has been very difficult. Most of the survivors didn't speak about their experience. Some of them reported abuses. Japanese accounts emphasize friendly relations between Attuans and their guards. Several of the Attu residents believe that the Japanese did medical experiments on their parents or grandparents. And on a visit to Japan, Nick Golodoff tried to get the medical records of the clinic where his father died, and he was told that all the records of the clinic had been destroyed after the war to avoid scrutiny into the treatment of the prisoners. And in his book, Nick describes an uncanny apparition he saw in the Japanese clinic the night that yet another of the Attu people had died. And I'm not worried about proving that happened. And I think on the whole, anthropologists have been more willing than historians to allow uncanny episodes, even mythical characters, to mix in with everyday factual events within the course of a single story. So these examples from my work show some of the dilemmas that I've faced in pursuit of telling the truth. I think that neither history nor anthropology can claim objective truth, and nobody else can either, really. Anthropologists, however, are less bothered than historians about the coexistence of multiple truths. Have I been able to find and present objective truth in my work? Not very likely, but I have been more successful in honoring multiple truths, I think. Both history and anthropology are squarely settled in Western culture, the home of linear thinking. Both disciplines, I think, have widened their perspectives, have acknowledged the biases of the observer. But anthropologists are more tolerant of ambiguity and different versions of reality. However, I suspect that we are more deluded than historians about our own biases and our obligations to the dominant culture. Both would agree that the truth is rarely black or white, but neither is it gray. It's more like black and white stripes. So, thank you.
I was waiting to learn. Can you hear me? You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. The next speaker we're going to have, our final speaker before we get to question time, is public historian and writer David Reamer. David Reamer describes his pursuits as academic and public scholar. He writes that he's interested in social justice, history, and community construction. He writes daily and publishes his thoughts on Twitter. He writes weekly in the Alaska Anchorage Daily News, I guess it's called now, and on a range of topics in other places, ranging from housing discrimination to waffles. So thank you, David, for being here today. David is going to speak about public history practice in Alaska, lessons learned from eager consumers. Please go ahead, David.
Sorry, I was looking at something real quick. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Good evening. My name is David Reamer, and I'm here to talk to you about some of the lessons I've learned from doing public history in Alaska over the past 3 years. Let's begin with the relevant background. Several years ago, I found myself somewhat falling out of love with traditional history practice, especially the more academic and institutional approaches. I was trained to love that academic path of publishing, journal articles, and monographs. But there was a conflict within this with my desire to spread historical knowledge as far as possible. Before returning to school to study history, I had worked as a book buyer for a retail chain. I had seen the minimal print runs and sales for academic presses. And as for journals, research has shown that perhaps Half of all published journal articles are read by precisely the editors, the authors, and no one else. Depending upon the study, from half to 90% of journal articles are never cited. Articles in even the best journals might be read anywhere from a few dozen to 1,000 times. And the problems with journal readership are multiplied when the journals are not even digitized or indexed. And among many institutions, to the extent that they concern themselves with usage, there is this implicit conceit that if the manufacturer a product, then the consumer will simply come along as needed. There is value in this hyper-focused pursuit of a topic by a professional, and readership certainly isn't the best arbiter of quality. But if your intent is to disseminate information, if audience is a primary concern, then academia or even grade literature is not the best avenue for history distribution. And what I saw around me was this closed circle of history production and consumption, historians writing things that historians read ad infinitum, this insular Ouroboros. And I had to wonder just how much of an audience is actually out there for history. And this was my first lesson. I began in 2019 with short history articles on Nextdoor, a neighborhood-level social networking site, which I chose because of its fantastic reach into the community. I was writing local history, and the neighborhoods closest to me, about a third to half of the households had a Nextdoor account. Nextdoor then led to me writing a weekly column for the local newspaper. This year, I've written 36 articles that have garnered 289,000 online views. I also began an Alaska history-focused Twitter account. It says impressions. Impressions are basically Twitter's terms for views. Last year, I had over 4.5 million impressions. This year, I'm roughly the same pace. Millions of views for what is still a small Alaska-focused account with 6,000 plus followers. And in this summary, rather than expecting the audience to find me, I tried to find the audience with some success. I discovered that the audience for history is larger than I previously dreamed, not adequately serviced by traditional history products. My approach is purposefully eclectic. In just the past 2 weeks on Twitter, I've covered shipwrecks, Alaska Native history, historical dogs, Alaska landscape paintings, aerial photography, ice worms, labor history, Alaska representation in cartoons, comics, and television, LGBT history, mega engineering proposals, pipeline propaganda, Filipino history, and maps. Serious topics like discrimination and less serious topics like the Portlock Sasquatch. My topics are eclectic for 2 big reasons. First, and to be very honest, I don't care about everything I write or post about. To be publicly engaged with history means you must engage with the history that the public wants to learn about from time to time. Not exclusively. Some of my greatest successes came with topics that no one knew enough about to request in the first place. But eclectic topics because the audience itself is eclectic. There is ego in picking your own topics all the time, which is understandable. You're doing the work, you're doing the research, you're doing the writing about topics that interest you. But if you care about the audience, if you care about disseminating information, then you should care about your approach. To look at this from a more formal perspective, there are evidence-based methodological frameworks for this type of approach, including community-based participatory research, aka CBPR. Though this is often utilized in health research, the CBPR concept and model are fully applicable to public history. With a CBPR approach, the product creation process begins with the creation of audience and/or stakeholder partnerships. Before you do the research, before you start writing down, before you go to the archive, before you look at the newspapers, you go and meet with the relevant community. Subsequent research is therefore iterative. You're going back and forth, research, community, updates, feedback with your public partners. This sort of scholarly public partnership exists on a continuum. What I do is not at the farthest, most stakeholder-driven way, but it is on this continuum. Elsewhere, you can describe it in ways of compliance to consultation to cooperation to fully collective action. Functionally, In my practice, this takes the form of audience suggestions, questions, feedback, or history, and as previously mentioned, diverse topics. When the Anchorage Daily News approached me to write a history column, it was my idea to include a feedback form at the bottom. On Nextdoor and Twitter, I repeatedly interact with people, responding to questions, adding follow-up, and seeking community knowledge. I frequently post or write about topics suggested by readers that I had otherwise no consideration or inclination towards. It's also not just being polite when you're doing public history. It's not just being nice. This type of back and forth dialogue fuels higher engagement with the audience. I'm going to pick a little bit on the Anchorage Museum here. Their Twitter account has over 14,000 followers. I have over 6,000. By our last 30 original tweets, the museum averaged half a retweet and 3 likes per post. The museum puts these posts out there, but don't actually interact with the community, and they get very little interaction back. This is an example of where a place like the museum could have a greater position of authority amongst Alaskans, a greater auctoritas. This is a small example of how to get there. My rolling engagement rate on Twitter is currently 3.8%, which means for every 1,000 people, I get 38 interactions. They click on the photo, they click on my profile, they like the post, they retweet, they comment, so on and so forth. This may sound low, but this is actually considered a very extremely even high sign of success. Influencers would generally be very happy with a 1 to 2% engagement rate. Corporations pay a lot of good money for rates that are only a fraction of that. Combined newspaper and Twitter, I spend about a day a week responding to questions and feedback, and the follow-through is how I get here. And driving engagement, more importantly, means I've made the audience more amenable to my messaging. The engagement drives the engagement, meaning ultimately they're listening and seeing more history. Not only has such engagement improved the product and enabled such dissemination, but it has also been very rewarding, very, very personal level. Why I keep doing this. This is one of the greatest compliments I ever received. This was a reaction to a post that then became an article and then a bit of a conflagration in the legislature about John Glenn, the Glenn Highway namesake, and his war crime conventions for torture in the Philippines. As a historian, this is just everything I could hope for. She read the material and it had an actual impact on her life. She took it back to her family. She had discussion. She shared it. Nothing could be better than this. For the newspaper, there once was an older woman from Minnesota. She lived in Minnesota. She used the newspaper, the form I asked to have at the end of my articles. She used that form to contact me. She knew her grandfather was buried in Anchorage, but she didn't know where. So I looked it up. I found where he was buried. He was buried downtown. His little marker was overgrown with grass, as many of the smaller markers are at the downtown cemetery. So I cleared that off, took pictures of the marker, what it looked like in every cardinal direction from the marker, showing her what it would look like if she was there. And I made her cry, in the good way. And, I kept going. That was my energy for the, next month, was having this type of impact on people. History at this little level. More functional lessons from doing public history. Assume the worst of your audience's attention span. Be concise, because you shouldn't expect readers to follow threads within a longer article, or from article to article in some multi-part series, or from one tweet to another within the same thread. Certain people on Twitter love their long threads. My last real tweet thread was a 3-parter on the 1929 opening of a Piggly Wiggly grocery store in Anchorage. Either the first or second retail chain in Anchorage, depending on how you feel about the Rexall branded drugstores. The first tweet of the 3 had over 3,000 views. Then it dropped to around 500 for the second and third tweets in the series. Don't expect people to keep reading. If you're going to have information, sometimes it is well to have it loaded at the beginning. This is the reason why the newspaper actually doesn't always measure engagement in terms of clicks as in how far you read in the article or how long you spent reading the article. And of course, another lesson is that every topic doesn't work in every medium. And in my experience, that particularly includes the more complicated aspects of race history, including racial passing. This tweet, specifically the openly African-American portion of it, angered a couple of people. Definitely could have worded it better, although it was a difficult thing to parse out in as few characters as you're given in the tweet. I was also very possibly the wrong messenger. Earlier that day, I had posted about Melvin Dempsey, who was elected a trustee and marshal in early Valdez, and Tom Bevers, who was an early city councilman in Anchorage. Both Black ancestry. Dempsey may have passed as Cherokee, and Bevers definitely passed as white. So Aiken really was this man, Pete Aiken in Fairbanks, really was likely the first Black man or woman elected by people who knew he was Black. An important milestone in Alaska history that I wanted to share. But racial passing is such a complicated subject. And it's not well suited for Twitter, where such dialogues are too easily, if not too often, waylaid by misunderstandings or trolls. Similarly, I recently came across something of a traditional song for the Lascaro cannery workers, but the lyrics included some anti-Chinese slurs. Again, this was a complicated racial dynamic that reflected the reality of Chinese and Japanese labor contractors versus the typically lower placed and compensated Filipino laborers. But if I shared this, reasonable people wouldn't be able to look past it because of the pejorative. The topic needs the level of gravitas and development, which is simply not possible. Then there is true crime. This has been more of a personal development, as I've written several times on true crime topics. And I've more or less quit doing them just for the growing sense of exploitation I feel within there, which they are often some of the more popular things I've written, but they're also clearly profiting off of, the worst things that could have happened in this history. And it's the sort of thing that each historian comes to it differently. Some, you could very credibly view it as bringing sunlight onto a tragic situation that has itself, illuminating other factors about Alaska at the time, shows greater context. I wrote about Muriel File, who was blown up in a car bomb in 1970s Anchorage, talking about how this was used by other men to threaten women around town, showing this pattern of violence existed. I wrote about the car bomb and then tried to add that in there to bring it some context and validate broaching the topic in the first place. But I am sure if I would ever do that again, if the older David would do that. Other lessons from public history that I've learned. And again, these are all lessons I've really learned from the people consuming. Images drive public engagement regardless of medium. For the newspaper, the lead photo and the headline are the more decisive elements on whether the story is right. A Twitter post without an image is asking to be forgotten. If you're creating history products, then there is an aspect of trying to sell it to the reader if you want there to be a reader. History is one of those fortunate or unfortunate disciplines where interested amateurs abound. You don't need a degree or to pass a certification to be a historian. Many, if not most people, consider themselves an expert on at least some aspect of history, even if it's simple as, 1980s Anchorage nightlife. And you're going to run into these people if you do history in the public sphere. You're going to invite criticisms. And at that point, there are two options, as I see it. You can intervene and correct. Certain situations that is absolutely necessary. Don't allow complete and utter falsehoods. I had one gentleman, I wrote about a Black protest and picketing of a local grocery store in Anchorage, and he denied it ever existed. That sort of thing I cannot let pass. If you choose this route, then of course you need to act swiftly, you need to act decisively, you need to be a historian with your receipts, with your evidence. Second, if it's possibly a matter of perspective or even not that important, you can do nothing. Don't feel the need to have the last word, which just encourages and fuels confrontations. Lastly, there's the most common type of history questions I receive, which can be summarized as, why is it called that, and what's that building story? People love these type of histories, even if they're not often the focus of academics. But it makes sense that people would be interested in this, in the names and buildings that are around them. These are the relics of history with which they would be the most familiar, with which they would interact on the daily. If you want to get closer to the person, you learn about them. If you want to be connected to your community, you learn about it. It is a form of community empathy, strengthened by these historical connections. And therefore, I have written far more on place name origins and building histories than I ever planned. All these lessons only begin to scratch the surface of public history, which can be obviously best learned from experience by actually getting out there, by getting products out into the public eye in a way which they will both learn of its existence and hopefully consume it. It matters more that there is history out there accessible and utilized, that everything is history. Use this variety of history to reach the audience, to pull them in. I pull people in with kitschy pictures of funny shirts from Alaska in the 1980s, and then they read about, some traumatic bit of racial history or, political corruption, mixing and matching, carrot and stick, sugar and vegetables. Thank you.
Hey, Rachel, I'm here. I think I don't know if Averil, if you're able to unmute. Well, in the meantime, I don't know if Rachel, if you'd be willing to, there are a couple of questions in the Ask a Question section, maybe serve as our interim moderator here.
So the first question that I see here is to all, how has social media changed, made easier or more difficult the work of social scientists, including historians? My experience is that people believe and repeat the wacky stuff they hear on social media, which makes getting to objective reality a lot more challenging. Sabina, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, like in this current position I'm in of kind of trying to design research and thinking about methodologies, social media is actually a really interesting place that a lot of anthropologists are starting to explore as a field site. So looking more at how people are, having a lot of these interactions that as an anthropologist you might be interested in on social media, and a lot of discourses going on. Like I know specifically I follow a lot of like Native people, for example, on Instagram, and a lot of discourse goes on about, Native influencers. There's a lot of sharing of like memes and just generally about like different events and kind of trying to get certain like activist practices going, that sort of a thing. So at least like from my perspective and just like with my other colleagues in anthropology, I think the biggest change that it is especially with COVID, is kind of creating this new field site that you can also do remotely, that can create really interesting, like kind of multi-sided dynamics that are different than anything we've had in the past. So.
Thanks. And I can say from my perspective that what I notice with the advent of more social media is that denying history has gotten much more common. I don't know if they're related, but people who get all their information from Facebook might just flatly deny information they hear from another source. And so that made me think of that when David mentioned that there were people that flatly did not believe that there were Black protesters outside of a grocery store in Anchorage. I mean, I think that sort of fast food source of information has led to more people narrowing their range of beliefs. David, are you with us?
Yes, I was answering a question in the comments.
Oh.
Hi. Go ahead, David.
I'm sorry, I was answering the question in the comments. What was the question for here?
How has social media changed or made more difficult your work? And yours was pretty directly related to social media.
If anything, it's enabled making connections. The ease of it so quickly. I mean, it's limiting. It's a very, like, I chose Twitter. I've chose not to go on Facebook or Instagram or anywhere else at the moment, although others are doing good work in those places. But even with the not exactly representative population I'm dealing with, I'm gaining insights on the daily, different ways of living, people in different towns, different villages, different cities, people who lived in Alaska and don't live here anymore, and vice versa. People who had more experience elsewhere or new to here. And I'm able to see that instantly at any minute. And that's been very good on broadening my perspectives.
Questions in the written questions that we should answer? I guess, can you hear me? I think the presentations were wonderful. It's the kinds of things that came up in the three of them were the problems for any kind of dealing with the consequences of telling a story, that historians, anthropologists, and others worry about that. That's important, and it affects what we choose to say and when and where we choose to say things. That's complicated. The multiple, often opposing points of view. How do you deal with that? What's true? What counts as true? I mean, we see this playing out, as Rachel pointed out, or maybe I think it was Rachel who just pointed it out, that people often deny things that other people view as unquestionable. What counts as evidence in trying to tell a story, in trying to come to an understanding? Does it have to be published? Does it have to have a citation? Does it have to be time-stamped or not? And how to use historic analysis that, say, all of you do, without exploiting it. And that is a question I have for Sabina, because it was something that you mentioned. And I wanted to ask you, how does a good audience person for work use it in a non-exploitative way?
So basically just like, what is the part of...
I can't hear
kind of
you,
the
Sabina.
reader?
You need to unmute yourself.
I think I did. Can you hear me?
Cody, can you unmute
Yeah, I
Sabina?
can hear Sabina. Can you hear us, Averil? Okay.
Put the mouse on your head and then look for the microphone.
What about now?
Right. Yeah, no.
I can hear you now.
Okay. All right. So are you asking like what the role of kind of the reader or the audience is in like receiving this information.
So, I mean, ah,
Oh, you're unmuted now, Averil.
thank you. I muted myself. I'm hopeless at this. I give up. I'm not going to do it next week. Okay. No, you said something that really caught my attention about your goals in writing in a manner that was not intended to facilitate your product, intellectual products being exploited by settler culture or settler analysis.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very important question and point. And I'd like to understand that issue a little more and also understand how to behave appropriately.
Okay, yeah. I think as I was kind of explaining it, I think that for me, at least, that starts on the part of the researcher, just because anthropology and I mean academia in general, but has this very long history of extracting from indigenous communities. So just kind of coming in and, you know, like this history of salvage anthropology, for example, this whole idea of, oh, we're saving the last remnants so that, you know, we as settler society can have that for the future generations, that kind of a thing. So I think, like, at least, you know, from my perspective, the first step is to interrupt that practice and just this idea that indigenous knowledge is something that, you know, is there to be extracted to fix problems, you know, like climate change. That's often something that happens where indigenous knowledge is placed as a fix for certain issues. So I think first the researcher needs to come in and be engaging in these respectful ways. And I think that kind of automatically closes off a lot of the potential for other extraction, especially if you're specifically talking about how you're trying to avoid that, because it brings attention to it. And I think that one of the biggest issues for like how this happens and how this keeps happening is that the very practice of it is erased. So, you know, the academy doesn't acknowledge that that's what's been happening. So I think just, yeah, first making sure that the research itself is ethical, and then drawing attention to the fact that, you know, this is not extraction, and critiquing certain literature that intends to perpetuate that type of extraction. Those are kind of like the three main ways that, at least for me, I see, you know, going forward and trying to avoid that in the future.
Helpful, thank you. Are there other questions? I see there's two other questions, David says. David, do you want to read them? Or read the first one? You sent a note saying that there were two questions that needed to be answered.
They're in the ask a question section, Averil, but I'm just pasting them into the chat right now for easier access.
Okay. Question here from the Anchorage Museum. That's not a question.
Yeah, this
okay.
one's
I
from
love this
Corinna.
panel. If there's time at the end, I'd also love to hear panelists' reflections on art, especially art that deals with history. How do the arts play into your thoughts here? Rachel, do you want to start us on that?
Sure. What pops into my mind is a comparison between anthropology and history that, as far as writing goes, and that fiction, that history is more like a detective novel where you're trying to find the clues and reach the end, whereas anthropology is more like science fiction. And that fits into my idea of the anthropologist having a more holistic view and wanting to create a whole culture. So that, yeah, that's the only art thing that popped into my mind.
David, do you have an answer on that? How the arts play into your thoughts about history?
Yes, I've been very interested in the representation of Alaska in art, trading cards, and comic books from outside, because they've all, despite whatever differences in the medium, they've all tracked that exterior perspective of Alaska from, resources extraction to military to resource extraction over and over and over. Um, those are hopeful future projects of mine, is actually to put that in order and analyze that better and deeper. Also, the tendency to eliminate people in the landscape, the continuing popularity of landscape paintings of Alaska, the way they tend to eliminate the people. Sidney Lawrence didn't put a lot of people in his paintings, but people love Sidney Lawrence. That's why I'm drawn with someone more like Eustace Paul Ziegler, who would put people into the landscapes where he saw them. He put himself into his paintings, actually. And it is that gap that I sometimes very fascinating, that people continue to like this. This is very similar to those mythos of a, unspoiled land. But the fact that people continue to love these are actually, I didn't bring it up in my presentation, but these are solidly my favorite tweets, most favorited tweets every single week are landscape paintings of Alaska. And it's the sort of thing that I post and don't necessarily love, but I'm intrigued at the reaction. So I continue to sort of poke at it, wondering where it will lead me.
There's another question that I had two also, which is, would the presenters be willing to post some seminal books or articles to delve further into the epistemological aspect of this subject? Sabrina, you mentioned many different noted scholars that some of us are not familiar with, and we'd like to be able to look that up. Would it be possible for you to post some of those in the chat afterwards?
Yeah, I can absolutely do that.
And if Rachel and David, if there are books that you'd like to reference,
Of
that
course.
would be awesome as well. Looking to see if there's, apparently the first question, who I should have credited, I really can't handle this. Sorry, I apologize to the present and future audience for my inadequacy. Are there any other questions that we haven't addressed, Cody or anyone else? Sounds like not.
I'm not seeing any.
Well, Rachel, do you want to turn yourself on? You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Whoops. I'm sorry. I have a question for Sabina. I wondered if there are any in Tlingit oral history or concepts of history. Is there much disagreement in it? Is there a way that disagreement on history is handled?
Yeah, I think it's just very different when you have something that has been passed down orally. So for example, in my research, I've many times heard a bunch of different versions of a story. Or for example, I think that the Dauenhauers in their book it's like a collection of Tlingit stories, they published multiple versions because different elders, had heard different versions. And sometimes that's just a personal thing, or sometimes that's a clan-based thing. And, of course, like when you're telling, an oral history, then to a certain extent, it's going to change every time based on the place, the audience, the storyteller, their style, what they've heard, what they remember, what they're kind of adding, that sort of a thing. So I feel like it's less of a question, within this context, just because people kind of understand that there are multiple versions, and that doesn't necessarily mean that, there has to be one definitive one, or that one has to be any more or less true than the others. So that would be my take on it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, Sabina, David, very much for your excellent and thought-provoking articles. I myself plan to listen to this again when I don't have to moderate at the same time. And I'm excited about what I'm going to understand as I do that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Averil.